Welcome to the world behind midnight, where forgotten soldiers tell stories that were never meant to be heard. The Antarctic runway was supposed to be empty. In 1954, Air Force engineer Raiden Barrera discovered giant tracks in the ice that measured 7 feet long. Command ordered them erased, but the giants that made them were still watching. I still remember the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of quiet that waits for something to happen. Antarctica in 1954 felt like standing inside a held breath, and every morning I woke convinced the ice was about to exhale. They told us we were building the future, carving civilization into a continent that had never asked for it. What they didn't tell us was that the ice already had occupants, and they weren't interested in sharing. My name is Raiden Barrera. I was a structural engineer for the United States Air Force, assigned to Operation Frozen Sentinel, a classified project to establish permanent airfield infrastructure at the southern edge of the world. The briefing made it sound routine: reinforce existing structures, expand runway capacity, install weather monitoring equipment, standard military construction in an inhospitable environment. What made it different was the location itself, coordinates that appeared on no civilian maps. A stretch of ice plateau the geologists called stable, but the local Inuit translators called forbidden ground. The flight down felt longer than it should have. Our C-130 Hercules fought headwinds that seemed to have intention behind them, buffeting the aircraft in patterns that felt less random than resistant. Through the porthole window, Antarctica revealed itself slowly, endless white broken only by pressure ridges that looked like frozen waves caught mid-crush. As we descended, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with concentration. The runway markers were barely visible beneath drifting snow, and the crosswinds were pushing us sideways at 30 knots. We hit hard, tires screaming against packed ice, and for 3 terrifying seconds, I thought we'd slide off into nothingness. The rear cargo ramp dropped, and polar air flooded in like liquid nitrogen. It wasn't just cold, it was aggressive, stripping warmth from exposed skin with predatory efficiency. I stumbled down the ramp behind the others, boots crunching on ice that creaked beneath our weight, as if testing whether we deserved passage. The base sprawled before us, prefabricated structures half buried in snowdrifts, antenna arrays rattling in the wind, diesel generators coughing black smoke into crystalline air. Everything looked temporary, apologetic, as though the buildings themselves knew they were trespassing. Carson Neal met us at the perimeter. He was the base commander, a career officer with frost-scarred cheeks and eyes that had seen too many Antarctic winters. He didn't smile or welcome us. He simply checked our names against a clipboard and gestured toward the barracks with one gloved hand. His only instruction was brief and delivered without emotion. Stay within the marked boundaries, don't wander after dark, and if you see something that doesn't make sense, report it immediately without discussing it with others. At the time, I assumed he meant weather phenomena or equipment malfunctions. I was wrong about that. That first night, sleep came in fragments. The barracks groaned under wind pressure, metal joints shrieking as temperature fluctuations caused expansion and contraction. Through the walls, I could hear the generators maintaining their steady rhythm. A mechanical heartbeat, keeping us alive in a place designed to kill us. But beneath those expected sounds was something else. A low-frequency vibration that I felt more than heard, like standing too close to heavy machinery. It rose and fell with no discernible pattern, and twice I awoke convinced someone was walking past my bunk, though the darkness revealed nothing. Morning brought the first evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. I was assigned to inspect the runway's southern perimeter, checking for stress fractures in the ice beneath the reinforced surface. The work was tedious and cold, requiring me to walk the entire length while recording measurements. About halfway down, near where the floodlights faded into natural twilight, I found the first impression. At first glance, it looked like a depression from heavy equipment, perhaps a fuel bladder that had been dragged and removed, but the shape was wrong. It was roughly oval, approximately 7 feet long and 3 feet wide at the center, sinking nearly 18 inches into ice that should have been too dense to compress that deeply without industrial force. I knelt beside it, pulling off one glove to touch the compressed surface. The ice wasn't melted or fractured. It was pressed smooth, as if something immensely heavy had stood there long enough to reshape the molecular structure. The depression's edges were sharp and clean, showing no signs of sliding or dragging. Whatever created it had simply placed weight down and then lifted it away. I looked around for the matching impression, the second footprint that should have been nearby. I found it 30 feet away, aligned perfectly with the first. Stride length 30 feet. Weight sufficient to compress reinforced ice by 18 inches. No tread marks, no mechanical signature. I reported it to Neil immediately. He listened without expression, asked if I had photographed it, and when I said no, he nodded as though I'd passed a test. He told me to mark the location on my inspection sheet and continue the survey. When I returned to that section 3 hours later with the afternoon shift, the impressions were gone. Not filled in or covered over, but completely absent, as if the ice had been replaced with a pristine section. The only evidence they'd existed was my notation, and even that felt increasingly uncertain as I stared at the unmarked surface. That evening in the mess hall, conversation died when I entered. Finn Trujillo, a meteorologist who'd been stationed here for 6 months, watched me with calculating eyes as I filled my tray. When I sat down, he leaned across the table and spoke quietly enough that others couldn't hear. He said the ice does that, heals itself when it wants to hide something. He said the indigenous hunters had stories about guardians that walked between the layers of reality, maintaining boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. He said every crew that stayed here long enough saw evidence, but no one who spoke about it openly ever got reassigned. They simply disappeared from the roster, as though they'd never existed. I asked him what he meant by guardians. Trujillo's expression shifted to something between fear and resignation. He said the old stories described them as ice giants, watchers of enormous scale, who walked between the layers of reality, maintaining boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. They didn't hunt or attack, they reminded. When balance was violated, when men built where they shouldn't, or disturbed what must remain still, the giants surfaced to deliver a message. The message was always the same: leave, or learn why you should have. He said the tracks were a warning, not a threat, and the smart thing was to acknowledge them without provoking further attention. I should have listened to him. Instead, I did what engineers do. I looked for rational explanations. I spent the next 2 days researching geological phenomena that could create such impressions, documenting every possible natural cause from icequakes to thermal expansion. None of them fit the evidence. The impressions were too regular, too deliberate, too precisely spaced. They suggested purpose and awareness, qualities that geology doesn't possess. By the third night, I'd convinced myself that someone was playing an elaborate prank, using equipment to create false evidence for reasons I couldn't determine. That theory lasted until I saw one forming. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours. A storm rolled in from the continental interior, carrying winds that screamed like wounded animals and snow that cut exposed skin like powdered glass. We were ordered to emergency stations, securing equipment and structures against forces that could flatten buildings or hurl aircraft across the ice. I was assigned to the generator shed, ensuring fuel lines remained clear and backup systems stayed online. The work required stepping outside every 30 minutes to check external connections, brief exposures that left me gasping and disoriented. During one of those checks, the floodlights failed. Not gradually dimmed or flickered, but instantly extinguished, leaving me in absolute darkness, broken only by the faint glow of emergency chemical lights inside the shed. The wind had momentarily stilled, creating a pocket of silence so complete that my own breathing sounded thunderous. In that silence, I heard it, a sound like enormous weight settling onto ice, a deep creaking groan that resonated through the ground and into my bones. It came from the direction of the runway, perhaps 200 yards away. Then it came again, closer, and again. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew with absolute certainty that something massive was approaching. The footsteps, if that's what they were, belonged to a giant. Something that moved with the weight and deliberation of enormous scale. The intervals suggested careful placement, deliberate movement from something that understood its environment and knew exactly where it was going. I stood frozen, not from fear, but from a primal instinct that told me any movement would draw attention I couldn't survive. The floodlights snapped back on with an electrical surge that lit the entire base in harsh blue-white brilliance. The runway was empty. The storm had resumed its howling assault, and the night was filled with wind and snow, exactly as it should be. But at the edge of the illuminated area, just beyond where the lights faded to shadow, I saw a shape. It was tall, perhaps 15 feet or more, and stood with an upright posture that suggested intelligence rather than animal behavior. Its outline was wrong, geometry that my brain struggled to process, angles that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. For 3 heartbeats, we regarded each other across that boundary between light and darkness. Then it stepped backward into shadow and was gone. I reported it to Neil. He didn't ask questions or demand proof. He simply told me to return to my quarters and not speak about what I'd seen. The next morning, I discovered that my incident report had been reclassified, moved from standard documentation to a sealed file that required authorization I didn't possess to access. Finn Trujillo was gone, rotated out on an emergency medical transport for reasons that weren't explained. His replacement was a young lieutenant named Quentin York, who smiled too much and asked no questions about anything. The runway impressions became routine after that. Every few days, new ones would appear at the perimeter's edge, always the same size, always the same spacing. Command stopped acknowledging them. Work crews would cover them with snow or mark them as equipment damage, but everyone knew what they really were. The base had been surveyed, measured, and judged. Whatever walked our perimeter wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was establishing a pattern, showing us the boundary we were expected to respect. Kane Schmidt arrived in late March with a team of scientists whose credentials were above my clearance level. They set up restricted laboratories in the southern quadrant, drilling core samples and running tests on ice composition. The work proceeded with military precision, but I noticed that none of them ever worked alone, and their equipment included sensors that had nothing to do with geology. They were monitoring something else, tracking movements or presences that standard instruments couldn't detect. Schmidt himself was a physicist with specialization in dimensional field theory, which made no sense for an Antarctic research station until I understood what he was really studying. I found him working late one night in the core sample laboratory, surrounded by ice cylinders that glowed with embedded luminescence. He didn't seem surprised when I entered unauthorized. He told me the ice here was older than it should be, compressed under pressures that exceeded any known geological process. Deep within the cores, there were structures, crystalline patterns that suggested intentional formation rather than natural accumulation. He said the indigenous stories weren't metaphors. They were observation reports from people who'd learned to recognize evidence of something that most humans refused to acknowledge. The Guardians weren't supernatural. They simply operated according to physics that human science hadn't yet codified. Schmidt asked if I understood what it meant to guard something across geological time. I admitted I didn't. He explained that the Antarctic ice cap had existed for 34 million years, an unbroken record of Earth's history preserved in frozen layers. Certain locations within that ice held things, structures, or entities, or memories that predated human civilization by orders of magnitude. The giants were less creatures than they were functions, manifestations of protective systems built by something that understood time differently than we did. They didn't patrol or hunt. They simply existed at the boundaries of forbidden spaces, ensuring that what must remain undisturbed stayed that way. He showed me satellite imagery marked classified. The images revealed patterns in the ice, geometric formations buried thousands of feet below the surface that extended for miles in perfect mathematical precision. The airfield we'd built, the entire base complex, sat directly above one of these formations. Command knew, Schmidt said quietly. They'd known for years, ever since ground-penetrating radar first revealed the structures during earlier expeditions. The official mission was atmospheric research. The real mission was to establish permanent presence above something that couldn't be allowed to remain unmonitored, even if we didn't fully understand what it was. I asked him what would happen if we dug down to reach it. Schmidt's expression became very serious. He said attempts had been made during previous operations, drilling projects that were supposed to retrieve samples from the deep structures. Every single attempt had resulted in the same outcome: equipment failure at critical depth, followed by the appearance of the Guardians, followed by base evacuation. The pattern was consistent enough to establish cause and effect. The ice was willing to tolerate our surface presence, but any attempt to penetrate to the protected level triggered a response that made continued occupation impossible. The next incident proved his point. A construction crew was excavating a foundation trench for additional storage facilities when their drill bit struck something that shouldn't exist at that depth. The impact caused a resonance that traveled through the ice in expanding waves, a vibration that shattered instrument panels and cracked structural supports across the entire base. The drill operator said he'd hit metal, not ice or rock, smooth manufactured surface at a depth where nothing artificial should exist. The decision was made to seal the trench immediately, but the damage was done. We'd touched something we weren't supposed to acknowledge. The Guardian's response came that night. The temperature plummeted to levels that exceeded the capacity of our environmental systems. Heaters ran at maximum output, and still the interior spaces dropped below freezing. Frost formed on metal surfaces inside insulated buildings. Breath crystallized instantly, hanging in the air like frozen speech. The generators strained under impossible load, their mechanical voices rising to desperate screams before one after another they failed, plunging the base into darkness and silence more complete than I'd ever experienced. Emergency lighting provided dim red illumination that turned everything into shadows and suggestion. Outside, through reinforced windows, I could see shapes moving at the perimeter. Not one giant, but several enormous figures that moved with coordinated purpose, circling the base in patterns that felt ceremonial. They weren't approaching, just establishing presence, demonstrating what they could do if they chose. The message was clear. We'd crossed a threshold, and now they were reminding us of the consequences. Chelsea Austin, one of the civilian contractors, began screaming around midnight. The sound cut through the darkness like a blade, raw terror without coherence. We found her in the communications room, backed into a corner, staring at empty air with eyes that saw something we couldn't perceive. She kept saying they were inside, walking through the walls, examining us like specimens. The medic sedated her, but her words stayed with me. What if the Guardians weren't outside at all? What if they'd always been capable of entering whenever they chose, and only now were they demonstrating that capability? Power returned at dawn, systems coming back online without explanation, as though released from some external constraint. The generators that had failed showed no mechanical damage. They simply started when the temperature allowed, as if they'd been paused rather than broken. Outside, the perimeter was marked with tracks, hundreds of them, forming concentric circles around the base. Each impression was identical, 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, 18 inches deep. Together, they created a pattern, a boundary that defined exactly how much space we were permitted to occupy. Neil called an emergency briefing. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he held the podium. He told us that the drilling project was permanently cancelled. All excavations ceased immediately, and new protocols were being implemented to ensure we respected certain boundaries. The word came down from Washington: adapt to the environment or abandon the site. Command had decided that whatever existed beneath the ice was worth monitoring, but not worth antagonizing further. We would maintain surface presence without attempting deeper access, observers rather than explorers. The new protocols were specific and strange. No drilling below 50 feet, no blasting or seismic testing, no nighttime operations beyond the established perimeter. Regular offerings, they called them acknowledgements. Gifts of food and fuel, left at specific locations, as though we were making tribute to something that no one would admit existed. The scientists hated it. The religious personnel were uncomfortable, but everyone complied, because the alternative was experiencing another night like the one we'd just survived. Melanie Christensen arrived with the replacement crew in April. She was a cultural anthropologist assigned to document indigenous knowledge systems, though her real purpose was to serve as intermediary between us and the entities we couldn't officially recognize. She'd spent years with Arctic communities, learning protocols for respectful coexistence with forces that Western science refused to acknowledge. She told me that every culture with polar experience had giant guardian traditions, stories of enormous protective beings that maintained boundaries between human spaces and places that must remain untouched. She taught us the rituals, simple actions, walking certain paths in specific patterns, leaving marks in the snow that indicated peaceful intention, avoiding direct observation of phenomena we weren't meant to witness. It felt absurd at first, performing ceremonies for something that command denied existed, but the incidents decreased. The temperature extremes moderated. The tracks still appeared, but less frequently, and always at the established boundary, rather than approaching closer. We'd achieved something like truce, though none of us understood the exact terms. I asked Christensen what they were protecting. She said the question assumed human priorities, that protection implied value in ways we recognized. What if they weren't guarding treasure, or knowledge, or power? What if they were maintaining quarantine, keeping humans away from something that would harm us, or that we would harm? The indigenous stories described places where reality was thin, where the boundaries between states of being became permeable. Such places required guardians not to keep secrets but to prevent disasters that arose from mixing incompatible forms of existence. The winter months passed in careful routine. We maintained the airfield, conducted surface research, and pretended that our real mission was something other than coexistence with entities that shouldn't exist according to official doctrine. Elsie Dunn, the base psychologist, conducted regular evaluations that were less about mental health and more about measuring our ability to maintain the cognitive dissonance required for this posting. Could we believe and disbelieve simultaneously? Could we follow protocols based on folklore while maintaining the professional detachment demanded by military service? Most couldn't sustain it. Rotations accelerated. Personnel requests for early transfer increased. The official explanation was harsh environment and isolation stress, but everyone knew the truth. Living here required accepting that reality had more layers than we'd been taught. That the certainty we'd built our worldview upon was only certainty because we'd agreed to ignore evidence to the contrary. Some minds adapted, others broke under the pressure of knowing things they couldn't acknowledge. Sidney Shields broke in June. He was a radar technician, competent and stable, until the night he went outside during a storm to repair a damaged antenna. He was gone for 40 minutes before we found him wandering half a mile from base, frostbitten and incoherent. He kept saying they'd shown him, that he'd been taken below the ice and seen what we were really guarding. He described structures that defied geometry, spaces that existed in more dimensions than 3, entities that weren't creatures but processes, living equations that maintained fundamental constants across reality itself. The medics said hypothermia caused hallucinations, but Shields' descriptions matched things Schmidt had theorized based on his ice core analysis, details he'd never shared publicly. How could Shields know about crystalline matrices that operated as quantum computers, about information storage systems that used atomic spin states rather than binary code, about consciousness templates preserved in frozen probability fields? Either he'd experienced something genuine, or he'd somehow accessed classified research he shouldn't have known existed. Neither explanation was comforting. They evacuated Shields on a medical transport. His records were sealed, his testimony classified. Official diagnosis: extreme psychological breakdown due to environmental stress. Unofficial reality: he'd seen something we weren't ready to understand, and that knowledge had overwhelmed his capacity to maintain the necessary illusion of normalcy. I wondered sometimes if that was the Guardian's real function, not preventing physical intrusion, but protecting human minds from truths we weren't equipped to process. Araya McKnight joined our crew in July as Neil's replacement. Neil had requested transfer, citing health concerns, though he showed no signs of physical illness. The truth was simpler. He'd reached the limit of what he could pretend not to know. McKnight was different. She'd been briefed thoroughly, understood exactly what she was commanding, and approached the situation with pragmatic acceptance. She told us during her first address that yes, there were entities here. Yes, we were expected to coexist with them, and no, that didn't change our mission parameters. We were here to maintain presence and observe protocols. Everything else was speculation. Her honesty was refreshing, but also terrifying. It meant command had shifted from denial to acknowledgement, at least internally. The program was expanding, not contracting. More bases were planned, more research sites, all located above the geometric formations that Schmidt's team had mapped. We weren't leaving Antarctica. We were settling in, building infrastructure for permanent human presence, in places that had been explicitly forbidden by forces that predated human civilization. The Guardians' reaction to this expansion would define everything that followed. I requested transfer in August. Not from fear, but from certainty that I'd learned everything this place could teach me without destroying my capacity to function in normal reality. My request was approved with unusual speed, as though command understood the value in rotating out personnel before they became liabilities. The night before my departure, I walked the perimeter one final time, following the boundary the tracks had established. The ice was quiet under a sky so clear that stars seemed to press down against the atmosphere. At the southern edge, where darkness deepened beyond our lights, I saw one of the giants, not clearly. Perception itself seemed to slide around its enormous form, refusing to grant definition. But I understood its presence the way you understand gravity, or time, through effects rather than direct observation. It stood motionless, patient, eternal. I raised one hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that felt both inadequate and necessary. The giant didn't respond, didn't move. It simply maintained its watch, as it had for millions of years before we arrived, and would continue for millions of years after we left. The flight out was turbulent. The Hercules struggled against winds that seemed determined to keep us grounded, and twice the pilot aborted takeoff before finally achieving lift. As we climbed, I looked down at the base, shrinking beneath us, the structures we'd built seeming so temporary against the vast ice plain. The perimeter tracks were visible from altitude, that perfect circle of impressions marking the space we'd been permitted to occupy. Inside the circle, human presence, temporary and fragile. Outside, everything else, patient and permanent. Years have passed since Antarctica released me. I've worked on construction projects across continents, building structures that stand firmly on ground that doesn't remember or judge. But some nights, when the wind rises and the stars are particularly bright, I feel that pressure again, that sense of being observed by something that exists outside normal perception. The Guardians aren't confined to Antarctica. They're a function that operates wherever boundaries must be maintained, wherever human ambition approaches thresholds we're not meant to cross. I've collected stories since returning, accounts from other crew members, classified reports that occasionally leak through unofficial channels, indigenous testimony that predates modern Antarctica by centuries. The pattern is consistent. Humans approach forbidden places. Ice giants manifest to establish boundaries. Cooperation allows limited presence, while violation triggers escalating responses. We're being taught, slowly and repeatedly, that the Earth has layers we're not yet ready to access. That progress isn't always forward motion. The program continues. More bases, more research, more personnel who sign clearances, acknowledging entities they'll never officially confirm exist. The Guardians adapt, adjusting their responses to match our evolving presence. Sometimes I wonder if this is what they've always done, across civilizations and eons, maintaining the boundaries that keep reality stable. We're not the first species to push against limits. We're just the first to document it with technology that preserves evidence even when we refuse to believe it. Recent satellite imagery shows new formations appearing in the ice. Geometric patterns that weren't present during my deployment. Schmidt published a paper, heavily redacted, suggesting these patterns are responsive rather than static, that they adjust based on human activity levels. If true, it means the structures beneath Antarctica are alive in some functional sense, aware of our presence and reacting to it. The Guardians aren't protecting ruins or tombs. They're maintaining quarantine around something active, something that responds to stimulation, something that might wake if disturbed sufficiently. I testified before a closed congressional committee last year. They wanted to know if the program should continue, if permanent Antarctic presence was worth the risks we were taking. I told them the truth. We've never had a choice. The moment we developed technology capable of polar exploration, we guaranteed eventual contact with whatever existed at the poles. Stopping now wouldn't erase what we've learned, or undo the relationship we've established. The only question is whether we approach that relationship with respect or arrogance. The committee's decision remains classified, but funding increased and personnel deployments accelerated. We're not retreating. We're institutionalizing, developing protocols and procedures for long-term coexistence with forces we don't fully understand. Future generations will inherit bases built on forbidden ground, technology designed around supernatural constraints, careers spent acknowledging what official doctrine denies. Perhaps that's how progress actually works, not through conquest but through negotiation with realities that refuse to conform to our expectations. Sometimes I receive letters from current crew members, messages that arrive through unofficial channels with no return addresses. They describe the same phenomena we experienced, tracks that appear without source, presences that exist at the edges of perception, nights when the ice itself seems aware and watchful. But they also describe adaptation, the slow development of protocols that work even when we don't understand why. Humans are remarkably good at normalizing the impossible once survival requires it. The last letter included a photograph. It showed the southern perimeter during a clear day, the ice plain stretching to a horizon so distant it curved with the planet. At the very edge of the frame, barely visible against the white, was a shape, tall, upright, patient. The photographer noted that it had been standing there for 3 days, motionless, observing. The crew had named it Patience, a joke that carried uncomfortable weight. What must it be like, I wondered, to be tasked with eternal watch, to measure time in geological scales, while brief human lives flickered past like mayflies? Did it feel tedium, purpose, or was consciousness itself different at that level? Experience without emotion, awareness without self. I dream about them sometimes, the Guardians. Not nightmares, just presence, standing at the boundaries of sleep, where reality blurs into something else. They never threaten or communicate. They simply maintain their watch, reminding me that some boundaries exist for reasons we're not meant to understand, only respect. I wake from these dreams neither frightened nor comforted, just aware that reality contains more than our civilization acknowledges, and that awareness itself changes how you move through the world. The Antarctic Treaty comes up for renewal soon. Diplomatic channels debate mining rights and territorial claims, national interests dressed in scientific language. But buried in classified annexes are different discussions, acknowledgments of factors that can't be publicly mentioned. Certain areas are marked permanent exclusion zones, not for environmental reasons but because continued presence there triggers responses that threaten base viability. We've mapped the forbidden places, not through agreement, but through trial and error, learning where the Guardian's tolerance ends. I have been asked to consult on the new generation of Antarctic facilities, structures designed to minimize provocation while maintaining research capability. The specifications are strange, certain building materials avoided, specific geometric configurations required, foundation depths limited regardless of engineering preferences. We're designing around constraints we can't officially explain, creating structures that acknowledge invisible boundaries. Future architects will inherit these specifications without understanding their origin, rules that persist because they work even when the reasons are forgotten. Alani Christensen published a book last year, Academic Press, Limited Circulation. It examined Guardian traditions across cultures, patterns of protective entities that maintain boundaries between human and forbidden spaces. The reviews were dismissive, academics dismissing folklore as primitive superstition. But she sent me an advance copy with a note. They're preparing the intellectual ground. Give it 50 years. By then, enough evidence will have accumulated that denial becomes untenable. We're just early. Perhaps she's right. Perhaps we're witnessing the slow process by which mythology becomes accepted reality. The incremental accumulation of evidence that eventually forces paradigm shift. Or perhaps the Guardians themselves are ensuring this transition, carefully revealing their presence at a pace human civilization can absorb without fragmenting. They've maintained boundaries for millions of years. They understand patience in ways we're just beginning to learn. The young engineer who replaced me lasted 18 months before requesting transfer. His reports, partially redacted, described experiences identical to mine, tracks without source, presences at perception's edge, nights when the ice itself seemed aware. But he also described something new: communication attempts, patterns in the track formations that suggested mathematical language, structures in the ice that appeared to contain encoded information. The Guardians weren't just maintaining boundaries anymore. They were trying to explain why those boundaries existed. This development troubles me more than the original encounters. It suggests urgency, that whatever exists beneath the ice has detected something in human behavior that requires clearer communication. Are we approaching a threshold that simple presence won't adequately mark? Are the Guardians escalating from passive observation to active education? And if so, what happens if we fail to learn what they're trying to teach? The indigenous stories include accounts of civilizations that ignored the warnings, peoples who pushed too far and triggered responses that erased them from history. We assume our technology makes us immune to such consequences. That assumption may be our greatest vulnerability. I keep the photograph from that letter on my desk, the distant shape standing watch at the perimeter. It reminds me that regardless of what we build or discover or believe, there are forces in this world that exceed our authority, boundaries we didn't establish and can't revise, rules written into reality's foundation that predate law or logic. The Guardians aren't enforcing their preferences. They're maintaining something fundamental, and our cooperation isn't optional. Only the degree of difficulty we experience in learning that truth. Sometimes people ask me what it was like, living among entities that shouldn't exist according to everything we're taught. I tell them it was ordinary, that the impossible becomes routine surprisingly quickly when you encounter it daily. The human mind is adapted for survival, not truth, and survival often requires accepting contradictions without resolution. Yes, the Guardians exist. Yes, official doctrine denies them. Both statements are simultaneously true, and functioning requires holding both without demanding they reconcile. The program expands. More bases, more personnel, more research into phenomena that can't be publicly acknowledged. We're building an invisible infrastructure around forbidden knowledge, creating careers and institutions based on realities we officially reject. Future historians will look back at this period with confusion, wondering how we maintained such elaborate systems around things we claimed didn't exist. Perhaps they'll understand what we're just learning, that civilization progresses not through resolving contradictions, but through developing increasingly sophisticated ways to function despite them. I received one final letter before I stopped receiving them entirely. It came from an address I didn't recognize, typed on paper with no watermark, no signature beyond a simple statement. They're not guarding what's below, they're guarding what's above. We had it backwards. I've never been able to verify the letter's source or meaning, but it changed how I understand the entire experience. What if the forbidden structures aren't dangerous to us? What if we're dangerous to them? What if the Guardians are protecting something beneath the ice from contamination by human presence, maintaining quarantine in reverse? That possibility reframes everything. It suggests that tracks and presences and boundary markings aren't threats, but containment procedures. That the Guardians are less concerned with keeping us out than with keeping us from spreading. Every human intrusion risks contamination of something pure, or ancient, or simply different in ways that human contact would corrupt or destroy. We approach this as though we're the vulnerable party, the ones at risk from unknown forces. But perhaps we're the contaminant, the dangerous element that requires careful management to prevent irreversible harm. I don't know if that interpretation is accurate. I'll probably never know. But it changes the moral calculus entirely, shifts us from victims or heroes to potential threats requiring supervision. The Guardians aren't our enemies. They're not even particularly interested in us beyond our capacity to cause damage. They're functionaries performing necessary work, maintaining boundaries that protect something we don't understand from something we are. That recognition carries a humility that most humans find uncomfortable. The suggestion that we might not be the center of every equation, just one factor requiring management. The ice remembers everything, Vin Trujillo told me once. Every footprint, every structure, every boundary violation. It maintains records across geological time, and the Guardians access those records. Learning from millions of years of boundary maintenance, we're not the first species to push against limits. We're just the first to document our own futility with technology sophisticated enough to be believed. Perhaps that's progress of a sort, the ability to create undeniable evidence of our own limitations. Or perhaps it's just another form of hubris, believing that documentation equals understanding. I'm an old man now. My service reduced 2 stories that no one quite believes, despite the classified stamps that prevent their dismissal. The young people entering the program look at me with polite skepticism, certain that their generation will finally solve the mysteries mine simply accommodated. Perhaps they will. Perhaps technology or insight or sheer persistence will eventually explain what we experienced in terms that official science can accept, but I doubt it. Some mysteries exist because they're mysteries, phenomena that defy explanation, not due to insufficient data, but because explanation itself is inadequate to their nature. The Antarctic program continues. The Guardians continue their watch. And somewhere beneath the ice, something old and patient and utterly beyond human comprehension continues whatever it has always done. Secure in boundaries maintained across timescales that make human civilization look like a brief flicker. We've learned to coexist with evidence of our own insignificance, and perhaps that's the real achievement, the actual progress made during those years on the ice. Not discovery or conquest, but the slow, painful acceptance that we're participants in systems we didn't design and don't control, that humility isn't weakness but accuracy, that knowing our place in the larger order is the first step toward surviving long enough to grow beyond it. If another story waits in the darkness beyond the ice, where the giants still keep their eternal watch, stay alert and remember that some boundaries protect us from ourselves. This is the world behind midnight. Subscribe for more stories from the soldiers who saw what command wanted forgotten, from the places where reality bends, and from the darkness that knows your name. Stay vigilant. The ice remembers, and so do we.